Doug Rushkoff is an American author, lecturer, and media theorist. He teaches media studies at NYU and the New School University and is a technology columnist for the Daily Beast. Today, Doug joins John Lebkowski and Scoop Sweeney on Plutopia News Network's podcast, 20 Minutes into the Future.
Today, our guest is Doug Rushkoff, author of many books, co-winner of many terms, including Digital Native and Media Virus. His latest couple of books are probably where we'll focus today in a free-ranging conversation. One is called Life, Inc., which is about the corporatization of human life. And the other is called Program or Be Programmed. And actually, rather than say what that book's about, I should ask you to say, Doug, what is Program or Be Programmed? What's the thesis of that book?
I guess the thesis of that book is that new media require new literacies, and that in a digital age, it's not really, it's not enough for people to know how to write. You know, they have to know something about programming. Ideally they have to know how to program. We're living in a highly programmed world, and if they're not going to understand how to program, they at least have to understand how to recognize a program when they're interacting with one. You know, I feel like people are getting all these very unpredictable results with the technologies that they're incorporating into their lives and their schools and their businesses. And I think the reason why these technologies are so unpredictable for them is because most people employing them don't know what the technologies actually do. They don't know what the technologies are for. They don't even know what the intention of the programs they're using are. So if they don't know what the intentions are, I don't see why they should be surprised that they're surprised by the results that they get.
So really, it's more a matter of thinking like a programmer than necessarily actually sitting down and writing code, right?
Well, in an ideal world, it would actually be sitting down and writing code. It would be, I mean, and I understand this is very, this is idealistic, but it would be like someone, you know, with the invention of text. When text came around, it would be, you know, instead of, you know, Moses and the Israelites who followed saying, okay, we're going to have an elite of rabbis that knows how to read and write, it would be them saying, you know, this reading and writing stuff is actually kind of a cool thing for everybody to learn. That as a civilization in a textual era, we should know how this works. That the alphabet's a lot easier to learn than hieroglyphs were, and it could really democratize things, and it could really enhance people's relationship to information. We should all just learn it. But I realized it took centuries until people saw that, oh, learning text is not so hard. And I realize it's going to take at least decades until our civilization does the same thing with programming and realizes that it's not just some esoteric technological skill, but it is the language through which beings and communities are going to be communicating and building their world. But no, if they're not going to get there, then at least I feel like we have to take the opportunity of programming to look at the rest of our world and come to recognize how different things are programmed, from our cities to our governments to our currency systems to our corporate legal system. That all of these things are programs embedded with agendas, usually the agendas of the people who first wrote them, and they are up for discussion.
So when you say program, you're really speaking more broadly than just about computer technology.
Yeah, usually when I'm speaking about programming, I'm speaking about the whole kit and caboodle. When I talk about, you know, living in an open source world, I'm not just talking about a world in which programmers are free to engage with the code of their software, but in which human beings are free to engage with the codes of their culture in an open source fashion.
It's like the idea of a social design, really, right?
Uh-huh. And being able to really distinguish between, you know, the given circumstances of our reality and the programs that have been written by people for particular purposes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I know that when you actually sort of sit and this is coming from kind of a Buddhist perspective. You sit and you sort of get behind your thinking, and you start to understand that there's so much that's just sort of running programmatically in your head. It's like Gurdjieff talked about how we are mostly asleep. Most people are just kind of walking through life as sleepwalkers. And what you're saying, I hear you saying something similar, that people are sort of programmed. They're sort of like in a program. The program is running. They're sort of like operating unconsciously as part of that program.
Right. I mean, you know, a lot of people talk about, oh, that person really pushes my buttons, or this pushes my buttons. You know, I mean, I understand that there's times when a human being is going to play tapes because they're so traumatized or because something's gotten so ingrained, but that should be the exception rather than the rule. And it seems as if, and I don't know if this is an artifact of Western non-Buddhist culture or not, but it seems like people strive to live in those programs rather than in spontaneous reality. It's as if living a program life seems less painful than living the real one.
Do you think
Go
you
ahead.
think some people take the path of least resistance? That just, if it's easy, it's much easier just to go with the flow rather than to uh, be an active participant.
Well, they take the apparent path of least resistance, which is actually a path of greater resistance and friction, and leads to their death. And then even if they live longer, it leads to the death of something else. So no, I think people take what they believe to be the path of least short-term resistance. But what they do is they end up painting themselves into corners where there's just greater and greater resistance, whether it's internally created or environmentally real. There's greater and greater resistance to aliveness.
Can you give us like a concrete example of somebody painting themselves into a corner like that?
Well, I mean, you could look at it on an individual level or a societal level. I mean, take what do they call it? QE2, quantitative easing. You know, what does quantitative easing do? Well, it releases the stress on the banks today by borrowing money from our great grandchildren. We're going to have to pay it back while the environment's collapsing around them at the same time. So you know, you can sort of relieve the short-term pain of a banker who's yelling at you in your congressional office today, but create greater problems for yourself and your family just next month, if not next year and next decade. Or an individual, you know, the path of least resistance might seem to be to flip on the air conditioner today, rather than understanding that in the long term, the air conditioner is actually going to make the world a hotter place and necessitate more air conditioning. So it's kind of all around. It's this. I talk about it a lot in my Life Inc. book. Is this notion of almost an insulation equation. You know, people look at, they look at their lives in terms of how much money do I need to make now in order to insulate myself from all the things about the world that I don't want to touch me or touch my children, rather than how much energy and effort can I spend making the world so much of a better place that I don't feel the need to insulate myself and my kids from it. So it's, what am I going to do? Am I going to spend $30,000 a year on private school for my kid so I don't have to worry about the sorry state of my public school? Or am I going to spend $10,000 or $20,000 of my time trying to make my public school better, so that I'm not worried about isolating or alienating myself and my family from it?
Can you say a little bit about, you talk a lot about in Life Inc. about the corporate mindset and how that's sort of been, how that's crept in, that's sort of informed the way that we all have started to think. What is the corporate mindset? What is it that people are doing in their heads that's sort of driven by the corporate form?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is, it dovetails with a lot of other kind of American and Western ideologies, from, Calvinism and personal salvation to the cult of the individual, and the notion of consuming our ways toward happiness, or the almost the destiny of any American to get to have his own house on his own property in his town. They all kind of tie into each other, but it's looking at kind of everything in terms of its cost benefit analysis. It's looking at people as competitors or as marks to extract value from. It's looking at the world as a series of territories rather than as this living thing to nurture. And it's looking at success in terms of the numbers on a bank account or the rates of return, rather than one's actual experience of life. People don't trust their moment-to-moment experience, and they look towards metrics. And this is not, I don't think, this is not the legacy of science as much as it is the legacy of business, of the zero-sum game that's embedded in the logic of 2-column or 3-column accounting, developed back in, I guess, late Babylonian times, but that was really incorporated into European business, where everything is understood as either a debit or a credit. If you get it on one side of the balance sheet, it's got to come off the other. So everything is a zero-sum game. And when we look at the world that way, we can't help but seeing everything as a bunch of fixed resources and fixed values that have to be ultimately disproportionately shared by people. So you're going to stake your claim, get your piece, and do what you have to serve your family.
It's kind of interesting. I was noticing that people who were reporting that their credit card interest rates were escalating and escalating. Somebody told me that his got as high as 30%, and it was always the people who were having the most trouble paying off their credit cards. So it seemed that they were being put in a completely untenable situation where they had no choice but to default. And then I realized that they had been, by some probably algorithm, they had been targeted as somebody who was actually likely to default, and the banks were just trying to collect as much as they can before that default happens. And I was thinking about how there could be so many other ways that you could handle this, ways that are, friendlier to the consumer, friendlier to that human being who's actually struggling there, trying to make those payments in good faith, and seeing them escalate and escalate and escalate beyond anything that they can hope to pay off. But instead, the decision is, let's soak them for all we can before they go under.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, and if you can pay back the credit, and then they don't have the leverage to raise your interest rate. In other words, if you owed $1,000, and they're doing a nice 8-10%, whatever, then maybe, okay, you'll let it ride because it's not so bad. The minute you see they're raising you to 30%, you're going to find the money and pay it off because you've got the wherewithal to do it. The person who doesn't have the wherewithal to do it doesn't have a choice. And once they're in that 30%, 38% bracket or whatever that is, they're not going to be able to move to another one either. No one else is going to take that credit cheaper. There is a kind of a vicious circle that's destructive to ourselves and our communities. When you buy something at Walmart instead of from the local druggist who you went to high school with, you become embarrassed to see the local druggist at a town event because you're no longer purchasing from him. So then you end up not going to the PTA meetings and not going there to your downtown and not using your community facilities because you don't want to run into the people that you feel embarrassed to be around because you're no longer doing business with them. And the center of the town, the bonds that tie people together, the quality of the schools, everything ends up going down. So almost every decision you make ends up feeding into this sort of negative spiral. But likewise, every positive decision you make starts feeding back into a positive cycle. So for a lot of people, they seem to experience, empowerment through just changing their style of consumption, just buying locally rather than from big box stores, figuring out ways to do that. Even if it means then developing local currencies and if you're not going to develop one yourself, just finding out who is and considering using one of them, starting to do favors for people in your town, setting up a babysitting club where you share babysitting hours, almost anything that you do that lets you exchange your time for value rather than working for a company helps reverse that trend. I keep looking at the news reports and everybody's talking about, unemployment and getting that unemployment figure down. Hell, I don't think we should get the unemployment figure down. Employment itself is at least the kind of employment that they're talking about is not what people want anyway. It's like, oh, we've got to fund a corporation so that it can afford to hire more employees. What is that about? That's just about, I'm going to work for some company that's going to continue to rape and pillage the municipality or the locality that I live in and make it harder for us to create and share value with one another. So almost anything a person does that engages with other people outside the corporate matrix is going to enhance our ability to create and exchange value for and with one another. Sometimes for money, sometimes for local currencies, and sometimes just as favors for other people. I mean, out here, it's as simple as the one person on the block that has the snowblower should let everyone else on the block use that snowblower. You don't need one for every single house. The guy goes out for half an hour with a snowblower, blows his driveway and the sidewalk in front of his house and shoves it back in the garage. And then the next guy takes his out. It's like, wait a minute. A snowblower per block, changes everything. Yes, on a certain level, a snowblower per block instead of a snowblower per house is bad for the economy because now the snowblower company that's listening to this, the employee of the poor snowblower company is thinking, oh my gosh, Rushkoff is going to get me fired because less people are going to buy snowblowers now. But if we actually need less stuff, then we've got to get to a place where we realize the object of the game is not total employment. The object of the game is total satisfaction. The idea of the game, the object of the game is to get enough food and clothing and heat to everybody who needs it and distribute it equitably. If it turns out that we only need to work 10 or 20% of the time to get all this stuff done, then what do we do? I mean, that's the nightmare that we're actually facing, is that our efficiency has gotten high. So what I would recommend is for people to start doing things in ways other than working for companies, getting money and buying them. Find ways to do things, to exchange value, to do favors, to accept favors, to volunteer at your public school, to promote literacy. There's so many ways to start to reverse this. And each thing you do is magnified 10 times. Just joining community-supported agriculture group instead of buying from the grocery store sets in motion a chain of events that will change your life and the life of everybody you know. It's really that easy.
Do you think we could really change people's outlook like that to where they could go from the way things currently are to more of a barter system? A lot of people don't think they have anything to barter. They're customer service rep at a call center. What do they have to trade?
Right. Well, I'm not talking about barter. I mean, barter is one-to-one exchange. So like you do something for me and I do it for you, back and forth. With a local or community currency, it's the same as any other money. It's just not central bank issued money. It's money that's earned into existence rather than borrowed into existence. So it doesn't have this bias towards the investment capitalist. It's not an investment scheme. It's a transactional model. But you bring up a real question, is that thanks to the industrial age, we have we believe that we specialized ourselves, but we really didn't. What corporate America did was it created jobs that depend on corporate America for their value. In other words, these are not jobs that create value for anybody. They're really only jobs that help a corporation extract value that's already out there. You know, so the corporate state ended up being able to create a job market that depends on the corporate state for its furtherance. And there is going to be some degree of pain as those of us who have jobs that really don't create any value for anyone try to figure out how we can create value for other people. But if we all go into jobs that actually create value for other people, we're going to find out we have more value than we know what to do with. So there'll be this kind of inflation of riches, this embarrassment of riches that a capitalist system that's based on scarcity does not know how to contend with. That's why it will not work with bank-issued debt-based currency. It's only going to work with a currency that respects value instead of what you owe.
So this sounds like one of the corners that we've painted ourselves into, that we sort of depend on. We depend on a continued production of more and more stuff that we don't actually need in order to bolster an economy that's just based on persistent turnover, more and more things being produced.
Well, right. I mean, and that worked for a time. Now the things being produced are abstract, right? The I don't know if we can say the vast majority, but a majority of money is actually just being spent with on finance itself. Now, there's more drag on the system than there is system. That's why we have to keep putting out our earnings into the future. There for every widget, every 9-cent widget that you or I can actually make in the factory, there's like $9 of investment capital being traded back and forth on it. So it's not that you're just it's not consumption that's keeping the thing around anymore. It's this faux banking investment, which is kind of a derivative on consumption, but it's not actual consumption. On the one hand, that could be seen as a beautiful and brilliant thing. It's a way to turn the economy into a game rather than a reality, so that we can leverage a little bit of consumption and or a little bit of resource depletion into this giant economic bubble. But the problem is it's been designed, the game has really just been designed to extract value from the poor and give it to the rich. And we've hit the wall on that. There's only so much more they can take, which is why really when you look at America and you look at the future of America now, this is not a place that the global corporate community, if we can call it that, is looking at as a place to share wealth or to develop a middle class. America is just a feeding ground, and this is an end stage capitalism that they're playing here. I do not think the heads of today's corporate conglomerates are looking at living in the United States. I mean, maybe in Bloomberg's bubble of Manhattan they'll keep a place, but these people are moving on to to other places to live as they finish off what's left of America's value. They really don't care what happens to us.
Is this to say that America is in decline? I mean, I was talking to a guy yesterday who he's like a lobbyist in D.C. now, and I mentioned this idea of decline, and he said, "Oh, no, absolutely not. We're not in decline." But it sounds like that's what you just said, right?
Well, America in decline. Yeah, it's a way to look at it. I mean, it's almost optimistic. An America in decline. I mean, America, I'm looking forward to, the decade or the century when America becomes capable of, creating new value again. There's this, gotta love them. I love the West Coast, and I love Silicon Valley, and I've been at Google and Microsoft and all these places and seen the kind of optimism of the young engineers in these places riding around on bikes and making stuff. And there's this sense everyone, wants to get me, oh, move out to San Francisco where you could become part of a new venture. This is the place to begin stuff. I don't think that they quite get how abstract and useless so much of what they're doing is, how unreal it is. They look to Europe and New York as, oh, that's the past, the dead models, the stock market and all that. And I don't think that they get that there's not going to be anyone to do the things that they're building, to buy them, that the real world is kind of crumbling behind these, these beautiful Google interfaces.
In Life Inc., you talked about the two economies, the real economy of groceries and houses and rent and cars, and the speculative economy. Is that something you're thinking has to change? Do we have to do away with one or the other?
Yeah, well, I don't know that we do away with something, but we can incrementally restore the workings of a real economy. The real economy and the speculative economy are kind of too tied together at this point. I read a lot of Zizek on this, and he seems to think that we kind of just need to stick with the current plan, maintain that kind of faith in the speculative market so that the economy can inflate, so that it can keep going. And as I look at it, I don't see the speculative investment economy as supportive of the real economy, but actually extractive of it. Whether, no one is really, venture is not going into helping create products. Venture is going into buying shares from other people who already invested in the thing. You don't need this giant amounts of venture capital to get businesses going. What the venture capital does is it guarantees that they're able to extract whatever value is being created, and they get to now redirect these companies towards maximizing efficiency and extracting value from the proposition rather than creating value with the proposition. So I do think that they need to be disconnected. But it's not like you go to Obama and say, okay, go disconnect these things, or you blow up the New York Stock Exchange or something. All you really have to do is begin to engage with people through some alternative means of value creation and exchange. And we see the beginnings of some of these. Etsy is the beginning of it, where people are just going to make stuff and sell it to each other online using traditional money and traditional, giant corporate credit card companies like, PayPal and Visa to do it. It's not like you have to have a revolution and burn something down. It's incremental. Or, these guys that I've gotten involved with at Superfluid, which is really just a way for people to collaborate on projects and keep track of who's done what and share services. It's the beginnings of an alternative e-currency, but it's organized in a way that maximizes collaboration rather than promoting the sort of competition that a scarce currency seems to demand of people. So there's many ways to do it. Again, a community-supported agriculture is a great way. Usually you have the opportunity that you could spend a day a week or a day a month actually helping on the farm. And that's a terrific way to reconnect with people and to see, how all this is actually working. For your kid to see, a carrot come out of the ground these days, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, we have a time exchange network here in Austin where a couple of guys like Tom Brown and Rich Vasquez have designed a system to support exchanges of time. So it's kind of like a complementary currency. It's a medium of exchange that leverages time rather than more abstract value.
Right, and it's not so difficult, is the thing. It just takes. It either takes people open enough to the possibility that they can create value, because most of them feel like you and I and Scoop do here. Most of them feel that we don't really do anything productive. That as long as they let me stay in this cubicle and I'm just going to do this stuff, they're going to pay me for it. I'm not going to say anything about it if they don't. And you can get by years like that in a corporate structure. But when you look at the real world and you say, okay, I'm the post-marketing real estate adjuster on ex post facto mortgages that don't really exist anymore, or whatever, you realize this is a skill that doesn't translate well into the real world. When you think in Mad Max post-apocalyptic terms, you think, well, what would I actually contribute? What would I contribute to the lone group of non-zombies on the top of the mountain this year? Not a heck of a lot if I've lived in a job like that. You really want to be a guy who knows how to make electricity or knows how to hunt or find water. I mean, shoot, if you just knew how to find water, you'll be valuable after the apocalypse, right? But most of us don't have many of those kinds of skills. I mean, the lucky thing is that these kinds of skills don't take forever to learn. You can apprentice for someone who knows how to do something, and really within a year become really good at something. Whether it's fixing shoes or dealing with plumbing. I mean, there's a lot of things you can learn in a year or two that are not totally unfun. The kinds of things that we used to call hobbies. And remember back when people had time for that, the hobbies, you build model rockets or airplanes, you do this stuff. You pick up something as a hobby and it could end up really getting you through difficult times. Like wife and I were watching this show. What is it called? That Millionaire Matchmaker. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
It's one of those reality shows. And there was, one of the guys on it who was, they fix people. They get these millionaires and then they present them with all these people who they can maybe have a date with to try to get fixed up. And this millionaire woman, they fixed her up with this guy who used to be a real estate appraiser, but then the real estate market crashed, so he wasn't doing that much appraising, and he's been go-go dancing. Right, so he's, so he got these great, whatever they're called, washboard abs and stuff, and he takes off his shirt and he dances for people. But hell, at least that's real, right? At least he's doing something, And a lot of us have skills. I mean, I look at my bevy of skills, other than writing media books and abstract treatises on corporatism. It's like, well, I know how to do stage fight choreography. I guess there's a market for that. High schools doing plays need someone to come in and teach the kids how to stage a fight that looks, somewhat real. Kids love doing that stuff. I'll get by. I could give piano lessons. I could teach math right through calculus. There's stuff that I can do that has value. And would it be less satisfying? I don't think so. I think in many cases it would be more satisfying. Certainly to supplement one's life and one's income with something that has agreed upon value, as opposed to speculative value, like writing a book or doing the kinds of stuff I do that I hope is valuable to people, but may not be, or is going to be less and less valuable as people become less and less willing to pay for text. I'm going to have to do more and more regular stuff. And I think we all are.
This makes me think about all those social media consultants who had to sort of abandon social media because there was really no market for it, because it has no agreed upon value, at least so far.
Well, most of it stinks, frankly. I mean,
Yeah.
The fact is most companies don't make anything that has any more value than any other company, right? They're making the same widget, the same thing, the same service as anybody else. So in such a world, the marketer is the only one who can help differentiate between those companies. But now everyone goes into marketing. So then how do you go meta on that? Well, the way you go meta on that is become like Seth Godin or someone. In other words, you now become the teacher, the marketer to the marketers, the teacher,
the guru.
Right, the guru of the marketers. Not that his stuff is wrong, his stuff is right. But he doesn't really teach marketing to companies. He teaches it to marketers. They're the ones, because it's a huge population of marketers.
Yeah, it's a guru business too. I mean, there's a bunch of them out there.
Right, it's just like the New Age was, where most New Age practitioners are not really practicing as much as they are not practicing as much as they're selling the practice to the next layer in the pyramid down from them.
So it sounds very,
of,
incest seems to be at the core of a lot of these endeavors. You talked about the crisis as opportunity, and you listed in the Life Inc. In the latest version, a lot of companies are businesses and people who are examples of this. Could you think of some really outstanding examples of this crisis as opportunity?
Well, they're all outstanding. They're just not giant. It's funny. It's hard to get like CNN or CNBC to do stories on these things because they're small. They're not like you can't just the person viewing it can't buy stock in it on E-Trade after the segment, so it's meaningless. But the restaurant in my town called Comfort that got halfway through its renovation, and then the bank basically went out of business. Stopped giving loans. He couldn't get to the other end of his renovation. So he's half renovated. He can't open the restaurant, and he's up to his eyeballs, in debt. So what does he do? We create a currency for just his restaurant so that people in the town could give $100 and get $120 worth of food at the restaurant when it opens. I bought $1,000, I get 200 extra. So we all get 20% return on our investment because we're all going to go to this restaurant. It's the only decent restaurant in our town anyway. He gets money cheaper than he can get it from the bank. He gets to pay back the money in goods and services rather than in cash at interest. And we all get to invest in our town rather than, in some piece of stock through Smith Barney. So it's a win-win-win-win. Plus we all end up being salespeople for the restaurant because we want the restaurant to stay in business so that we can spend our $1,000 there. So that was one, and there's a bunch of them that really just did sort of novel styles of raising capital to get themselves in business, from a bookstore to a local art house cinema. There's a Free Cycle, which really started because a guy had a bed that was in perfectly good condition that he didn't want to throw away, but he didn't have room for it anymore. And he just posted that he had a bed, and it turned into this movement called Free Cycle. You can go to their website, I think freecycle.org, and it's really just for people to give away stuff that they don't need and other people to get it for free. And there's billions of dollars worth of stuff being given away that way. Or there's a Trailways effort, which is people just trying to create basically a bike path and a walking path from Maine to Florida. And so what they're doing is different people in their town, they're kind of crowdsourcing it to go to your own town and to get a certain amount of land reserved for this pathway. And in doing so, you end up kind of creating this nature trail that goes, across the whole country. There's a woman, Carrie, who started a babysitting club, and she created a template for people to create where she's, because she's been through the first 5 years of a real babysitting club. She knows the ups and downs, what works and what doesn't. She created the agreements and the forms and the way to do a schedule and the way to trade the hours, which is terrific. I mean, people who start babysitting clubs end up, bizarrely, they kind of change the communities that they live in because it sets in motion a whole chain of associations and connections and new ways of looking at things. I mean, it's a lot easier to join a babysitting club with some of your neighbors where you put in a couple of hours babysitting your neighbor's kid and then they put in a couple of hours babysitting your kids. It's a lot easier for people to swallow that as an alternative economy than to get them to, start using, superfluid pints instead of US dollars to get a job done.
Well, it turns into a meaningful social network too.
Right. It does, but it primes that behavior. It anchors that behavior in positive social feel-good activity. And then they start thinking, oh my gosh, you mean work could be like that too? What would that be like? So it begins that process.
One of the inevitable offshoots of this kind of thing is a certain conservative person might accuse you of being a communist. I think one of your reviews for Life Inc. said something to that effect, that they expected you to be accused of being a communist. And of course, that's a big bad word in this country. And once you start having those kind of businesses and social groups popping up, immediately conservatives might think this is some conspiracy, some socialist conspiracy. That's a favorite word they use these days.
Well, they're insane. I mean, so they're obviously going to start seeing stuff like that. I'm accused as much of being a radical conservative as I am a liberal communist. In fact, I'm actually getting more critique from the left for being sort of implicitly anti-union and anti-big government and anti-healthcare plan kind of stuff than I do from the right. You know, what I would love the right wing to do is to reclaim Adam Smith, is to reclaim the real principles of a free market. Because in a free market, you wouldn't all have to use the same kind of money. In a free market, currencies would be allowed to compete with one another completely legally and freely. You know, you wouldn't have to depend on mega corporations and mega banks. If any of these so-called conservatives were to read Adam Smith and see that he hated corporations as much or more than he did government, that he believed in local scaled businesses having the dominant, the dominant and lion's share of the wealth, they would see a very different picture of capitalism than is presented in The Economist, you know, who claim folks like Adam Smith as their patron saint. You know, if I'm anything, I guess I'm what it would be, an anarcho-syndicalist. Are people allowed to be that anymore, or is that?
Oh yeah, sure.
All right, guys. So I got to read up on the history of it, but because I don't know anything in historical perspective for those kind of movements, but I understand what they believed, and that one seems the closest, where people get together and do business. You know, I'm all for business. I'm all for commerce. I think commerce is a great thing. It should just be part of our real lives. You know, I was raised in the suburbs where there was no commerce, right? There were some stores, but I was raised in a place that was extracted from where people do stuff. And what I want is to bring all that back together again. Religion, politics, commerce, sex, gossip, media, socializing, education is all part of the same thing. It's part of the same world. These arbitrary divisions just don't work anymore. They don't work for anyone. But so that's not communist. I'm a collectivist. I think that we can do stuff together, and that's work together, play together, trade together, make money with one another. I just don't see the same sort of zero-sum game, and I think that most of the conservatives who believe it's a zero-sum game, going back to programming here, don't recognize the fact that the economy that they are seeing is working on a 13th century scarcity-based central banking operating system. That's not the real economy. That this is a game. This is a game board. That there are other kinds of money and other ways of transacting, and they were made illegal by people with cannons and swords back from the 11th to the 17th century, and we can revive them without weapons, much to our economic health.
I see a lot of people leaving their cubicles and moving into co-working facilities and setting themselves up to do this or that kind of freelance work. And I was talking to one of these guys yesterday, Brian Russell, who runs a co-working facility out in Raleigh, Durham. And he was kind of talking about the problem of kind of thinking about how to scale that.
Absolutely. As long as not everyone wants to be making websites, you know, because there's only going to be so many WordPress templates out there that you can sell.
Right.
And as long as you're really not so worried about scale, you know, I'm over scale. I don't need to do the thing. I mean, I talk a lot about this at the end of life thing. I don't need to do the thing that solves everyone's problem for everybody. You know, you just need to do enough to make a living. You know, that's the object of the game, is to make a living, have fun, and get to the end without starving to death. And that's really not that hard to do. It's when you see scaling up as a prerequisite to success that you get in so much trouble, because scaling up usually means scaling up and away from the thing you actually do. from the thing that's actually fun. Scaling up usually means, becoming a corporation, becoming a shareholder, becoming a manager rather than becoming a doer. And the more we are middle management, the less we are creating value and the less fun we're having.
It seems like a lot of the successful independent doers inevitably get sucked up by a big corporation as soon as it shows some potential for success or money making.
Right, and it's really hard not to be sucked into that. It's extremely difficult not to be. I mean, and it's really tempting to take it. I mean, that's the one place that you could look at a guy like Mark Zuckerberg and say, well, at least he didn't take it. You know what I mean? He's still indie to that extent. Whether he's doing that out of greed or because he really just wants to maintain a company doing what he wants to do. Yeah, you don't have to. You don't have to do it. I mean, the trick is we live in an economy where it's really hard to just stay still. It's really hard to have a sustainable business. If you borrow money from the bank, you're not allowed to have a sustainable business. You have to keep growing. You just pay it back. Get out of debt. If you can stay out of debt, you can grow a business organically and then have fun and engage with people and focus on creating value rather than growth. But that's hard to do unless you're conscious. It's hard to do unless you're aware of the underlying programs that are shaping and dictating the terms under which people do business with each other. If you accept these terms at face value without understanding anything about them, then caveat emptor. Then you're going to end up in that system, and you might not be as happy or successful as you would have been just doing your thing.
Scoob, did you have one more question you were going to ask?
Just basically the things you've talked about today would almost require congressional approval, if you will, in a country like this. And chances of that happening anytime soon, just given the conservative bent of the Congress, it seems to be ruled out. How do you move toward this kind of a decorporatized
laws or any? You share the snowblower, start a babysitting club, join community-supported agriculture, get your kid out of private school and start volunteering at the public one. Just coach a baseball team. I mean, there's so much you can do right where you are that changes the friggin' world. Where I am, I mean, gosh, we need people to start pulling. There's this invasive Japanese ivy stuff yanking down all the trees here. Nobody seems to realize that that's happening. That's easy. Just go out with the groups and start cutting that stuff down. So it's really just reclaiming a little bit of time and creating value for yourself and other people with it in any way you can. Go look, go to my webpage, go to lifeincorporated.net and look at the resources, and you'll see 50 ideas of stuff that you can do now to make some money and create some value. You don't have to do that. And then the Walmarts and those things end up withering on the vine because we're just doing less there. We're giving them less of our money. Once we reconnect with one another, you don't need to change the entire legal framework. The giant corporate structures that are lobbying and creating the legal framework end up less powerful because we're giving them less money, because we're undermining their monopolies just by seeing through them, rather than by changing any laws.
You can learn more about Doug Rushkoff at his website, rushkoff.com, or by picking up a copy of his latest books, Life, Inc. and Program or Be Programmed. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney for the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.